Hi folks, welcome to another video that is not quite an episode of Trek Actually, even though it's going in the same playlist. It's more of a not actually Trek Actually, except I did write some pretty extensive notes for what I'm going to talk to you about in this video, so it's not quite a not actually Trek Actually either. It's more of a less than a Trek Actually, but more than a not actually Trek Actually, because while it lacks the focus of a fully scripted video, it does adhere to a simple but consistent structure, rather than present me speaking extemporaneously on a chosen topic, having not taken the step of completing written preparation video. But just for the sake of brevity, let's call it not actually Trek Actually. I'm not doing another Trek Actually comment responses video until next month, but there was a comment left on my most recent Trek Actually video, the time travel video that just went up a week before this video goes up, who was actually Star Trek's most reckless time traveler, that was so interesting and got me to thinking about something so much that I figured it just deserved its own video. So here's the comment that was left by Frank Voigt, and Frank says, "So I get your problems and reservations with the Voyager finale. I share them, as a matter of fact. But how would you write it differently? What motivations or circumstances would make Janeway's decisions legit for you?" Now, I thought that would be an interesting exercise. So I put some thought into it, I took some notes, and I'm going to share with you what I came up with as my alternatives for a series finale for Star Trek Voyager that I think would have worked better than what they ultimately made with Endgame. I came up with two pitches, one for an altered version of Endgame, and another for a totally different episode that I think would have been a really good way to wrap up the Star Trek Voyager series if they had gone in just a completely different direction than the direction that they went. But before I go in to either of these ideas, I want to make clear that I am a person sitting here on a YouTube channel with the benefit of, 18 years of hindsight. So please don't take this as me, oh, there goes Steve shitting on Voyager again. He thinks he could have done better. I really don't mean it that way, and I hope you don't take it that way. Also, as I've already mentioned, I do have notes on the pitches for the episodes that I'm going to be talking to you about, so they will be down here. So if you see me looking at my lap, it's because I'm checking my notes. I'm not transfixed by my crotch or anything. I don't need to be, okay? I'm familiar with the area. I know right where everything is. The first pitch I have to share with you is for an episode that I'm calling Endgame 2.0, because this would be very similar to the episode that we actually got. The main difference between the episode that actually exists and my proposed fanfic rewrite of it is in the setup. I think the setup needs to be a lot different. So we would still open 26 years in the future, but instead of things being pretty good, the world is a complete nightmare. The Voyager crew made it home, as in the existing episode, but they made it home by traveling through a transwarp conduit. And just before the Voyager ship entered the transwarp conduit, they were attacked by a Borg ship that destroyed Voyager and left most of the crew dead. But survivors were able to escape the ship before it exploded in shuttlecraft and escape pods, and they escaped through the transwarp conduit and made it back to the Alpha Quadrant, even though the ship and many, if not most, of their crewmates were killed. Now, years after that, we find ourselves in this era of 26 years later, this dystopian future for Starfleet, where the Federation has been basically destroyed and the Alpha and the Beta quadrants are dominated by the Borg. Just the Borg have overrun every place. There is a small fleet of rebels that survives and continues to fight the Borg and resist and try to sort of carry the flame for the non-Borg species. And among this fleet of rebels includes some Voyager survivors. And I'm thinking particularly Janeway and B'Elanna. When we meet the rebels in the beginning of this episode, in the 26 years later future, they've been working on this new weapon for months. They've been putting all their resources into building this new weapon, which is kind of like a supercharged Star Trek version of an EMP device, where once they activate it, it totally shuts down all the power on a Borg ship. It just turns everything off like immediately. And that allows them to go aboard the ship and take their equipment and download their database and just sort of pilfer the Borg ship after it's been hit with this weapon. So after a little bit of a build-up, they unleash their new weapon on a Borg scout ship, and it works pretty good, and they shut everything down, and they board the ship, and they download the ship's database, and everything's going great. And then B'Elanna makes a shocking discovery when she's going through the data that they get off of the Borg ship. She discovers evidence in the Borg database that the Borg have only been able to take over the Alpha Quadrant as completely as they have over the last 26 years or so because they utilized time travel to rewrite history. Janeway has a hunch, and she says to B'Elanna, go back through the sensor records from the shuttlecraft and the escape pods that escaped the battle that Voyager had at the transwarp conduit with the Borg before we all made it home from the Delta Quadrant all those years ago. And B'Elanna goes through the sensor logs that they have, and she finds signs that the Borg ship that attacked Voyager at that transwarp conduit had recently done some time traveling. Maybe there was a higher than usual concentration of chronotons in the ship's hull or something. Just make up some technobabble, time travel related Star Trek stuff, and B'Elanna finds that, and she can conclude pretty confidently that the ship that attacked them way back when they were about to make it home was a ship that had just time traveled and presumably had come back there specifically to stop them from getting home or to do something at that point in history. The Borg wanted to destroy Voyager at that point because in the original timeline, Voyager prevented them from conquering the Alpha Quadrant. And then B'Elanna suggests, or maybe it was someone aboard Voyager, which would explain why survivors were allowed to escape. Because what happens in the attack is the Voyager is damaged so extensively that it does eventually explode, but the Borg kind of pull back their attack after a certain point. And that's always sort of puzzled B'Elanna and Janeway. Why didn't they finish us off? Why did they stop there? So B'Elanna says, well, maybe one of the people on board Voyager that was killed in the attack was the reason, and they didn't necessarily have to blow up the whole ship. Once they were satisfied that the individual they were after had been destroyed, they cut off the attack because the Borg are very efficient and very logical and very rational, and they just said, okay, we've accomplished our mission. No need to keep fighting. No need to keep shooting at the ship. So anyway, they figure all this out. They decide that one of the crew members who were killed during the attack must have been the key person that the Borg had traveled back in time to destroy. So they're determined now to travel back in time themselves and prevent the Borg time travelers from changing history and taking over the Alpha Quadrant. So they salvage all these pieces of equipment from the Borg ship that they hit with their EMP device. They cobble together a sort of Borg time travel device using methods similar to what the Borg used in Star Trek First Contact to travel back to 21st century Earth to stop First Contact. And they figure out something that works, but there are a few catches to it. The first problem is that it will only be precise enough to put the time traveler within a few days of the point in history that they're aiming for. So they can't just pinpoint, okay, we have to go back to this moment and change this. They'll have to be within a few days. It can only transport one person. It's a one-way trip, so the person who travels in time cannot come back to their own time. And they only have enough juice to use it once. So it's a one-shot deal. So they can't just keep infinitely trying over and over again until they get the time travel just right. Janeway, of course, declares that she will be the one to travel back to the past because she is guilt-ridden over surviving the destruction of Voyager in the first place instead of going down with the ship. And the reason that Janeway survived instead of being destroyed with the ship was she was badly injured during the attack, and before the ship was destroyed, Chakotay, loyal First Officer Chakotay, made sure that Janeway was on an escape pod and was clear of the ship before the ship blew up. And Chakotay was one of the people who was on Voyager when it exploded. So Chakotay didn't make it. He died having saved Janeway's life. And she's always felt guilty about this. And now she's resolved to put things right so that Chakotay will not have died saving her, and history will wind itself forward in a more satisfactory way. So just as Janeway is preparing to make the time jump, we need to have a little bit of action. So we'll have a Borg fleet arrive to attack the rebels right as Janeway is about to make the time jump. And they have to run and fight, and their power is drained, and they're taking damage. And Janeway just barely makes the time jump. She escapes through the time portal, whatever, before the rebel fleet is obliterated. So now Janeway really has No escape plan, no way back. All of her friends are dead. She's gone into the past. She's the only one left. And now she has to accomplish her mission to prevent this horrible future. So Janeway arrives in the past, which, to remind you, would be the year 2378, the year that the rest of Voyager's 7th season takes place. And from this point on, the episode will proceed more or less as it did in the original version that they actually produced. Future Janeway finds Voyager maybe a day or so before they go through the transwarp conduit that gets them back home, where they're attacked by the Borg and everybody dies and they have to get into the escape pods and all that stuff. She arrives a day or two before that, and she goes aboard Voyager, and they go through the whole rigmarole of testing her DNA and confirming that her identity is what she says it is. And she warns them about the Borg ship that is waiting to ambush them. And she says, if you go to that transwarp conduit you just detected, there's a Borg ship there waiting for you. You won't detect it until it's too late, and then they'll attack you and they'll destroy the ship, and most of us won't make it back to the Alpha Quadrant, so you have to avoid that. And she tells them that they need to, for the moment, just set aside their dream of making it home soon, because it's much more important to the future that they survive, that they not be destroyed by the Borg in the next couple of days, because that's what changes history. During the preparations, future Janeway talks with 7 of 9 about this neuroparalytic toxin, this neuroparalytic virus that she's been working on. And future Janeway remembers this because she had been briefed on this virus while she was captain of Voyager way back in the day. And suddenly, future Janeway remembers that the Borg broke off their attack after 7 was killed. 7 had escaped to a particular shuttlecraft, and when 7's shuttlecraft was destroyed by the attacking Borg ship, that's when they pulled off their attack. So she kind of looks at 7 and she's like, it's you. You know, you're the key to this. You're the person who has to survive. And she figures it has something to do with this neuroparalytic virus that 7 has been developing. So pretty soon, the time-traveling Borg, who came back to ambush Voyager, realize that their ambush has been thwarted, and they get in touch with the Borg living in this time, and then the Borg all sort of converge on Voyager's position. Realizing the importance of keeping the Borg from conquering the Alpha Quadrant, 7 actually takes it upon herself to play the hero, and she transports herself aboard a Borg ship, intending to sacrifice herself by infecting the Borg with this neuroparalytic virus that she's come up with. But future Janeway is determined that 7 is not going to die this time, no matter what the consequences, no matter what happens. 7 is going to make it. That's the whole reason that she now realizes she has come back. So future Janeway follows 7 over to the Borg ship and sends 7 safely back to Voyager, and then future Janeway infects herself with the neuroparalytic virus, and then she is assimilated by the Borg. She can still have her confrontation with the Borg Queen, where the Borg Queen is like, and Janeway's like, must be something you assimilated. You know, because that's a really awesome, badass Janeway moment in the episode that they actually made. So it would be nice if we could keep that in some way. So it all sort of unfolds from that point, more or less, as it actually does in the finished episode. Voyager can find another transwarp conduit to the Alpha Quadrant to make it home and escape through it while destroying the transwarp hub, crippling the Borg's ability to travel throughout the galaxy and sort of staving off the immediate threat of the Borg to the Alpha Quadrant. The ship makes it home, everyone survives, and future Janeway courageously sacrifices herself to deal a serious blow to the Borg. So it all works out more or less as it does in the finished episode. It just, in my mind, has a much better setup, so that future Janeway's time travel is much more justified. She's not just going back in time because things didn't work out as well as she wanted to. She goes back in time because things worked out terribly. The Borg took over the galaxy, and she finds evidence that the Borg took over the galaxy because they cheated first. They used time travel to go back and change history first. So Janeway is not just going back to prevent a horrible future, she's going back to prevent a horrible future that never should have happened. Also, I want there to be a scene at the end of the episode where Voyager docks at Space Dock, and we see the crew disembarking through an airlock, and there's a scene where Tom and B'Elanna and their newly born daughter walk off, and there is Admiral Paris, Tom's dad, and we see the reconciliation of those two characters, because longtime viewers of my Star Trek stuff will know that has bothered me for a long time, that they went to the trouble of introducing Admiral Paris, Tom's dad, as a recurring character in the final season of Voyager, and then they ended the show without paying that off, without having a scene of father and son together, reunited when the ship makes it home. So I would put that in before we finally fade to black. That's my pitch for Endgame 2.0. It's not perfect. It's not complete. I'm sure those of you watching can find a lot of holes in it or can have suggestions for things that I didn't talk about that maybe would work in the episode or would make it better. This is just a general pitch, just a general idea of, okay, here's what we can do if we wanted to write an episode that was like Endgame, but fixed some of the problems that I personally think Endgame had. There are some problems with my pitch, or some things that I left out. Like, for instance, we need to figure out what to do about Tom and B'Elanna's baby. It needs to be born at some point. I imagine we could probably do it similar to how they do it in the actual Endgame episode, but that needs to be resolved. And also, in my pitch, there's not really much of a story for present day Janeway. There's a lot of future Janeway stuff, but not a present-day Janeway story. And I would like to give present-day Janeway something meaningful to do in the episode as well. An important choice or a character arc to travel or something that gives her a meaningful story in the final episode. So I haven't got that in this, but if any of you have any ideas or any suggestions, I'd be thrilled to read what you have to say in the comments. Now, this is the one that I'm actually really excited about. This is my pitch for a completely different Voyager episode that would not be like Endgame at all. Go in a completely different direction. And I thought about this for a couple hours over a few days as I had time to sort of sit and think about it. And I'm really kind of happy with how I came up with this. I think if this pitch were made into an episode back then, if somebody could have magically come up with this idea back then, and they could have found ways to fill in the holes that are going to be in this thing that you're going to see as I lay it out to you and blow it up and build it out into a proper episode, I think this could have been really, really great. I'm insufferably pleased with myself about that. This pitch for the completely alternate Voyager finale is something I am titling Pale Blue Dot. No time travel, no Borg. Maybe we could have some Borg in there for an action set piece somewhere if we need to sort of liven things up or pad out the running time if we do this as a 2-hour, a double episode as they did with Endgame. But the Borg conflict is not the centerpiece of this. The story centers on a breakthrough by Harry Kim and Seven of Nine, who, working with Barclay at the Pathfinder project back in the Alpha Quadrant at Starfleet headquarters, have devised a way to use the artificial wormhole that allows Voyager to communicate intermittently with Starfleet to actually transport the entire crew home. The procedure is very risky, and there is a ticking clock. They need to do this soon or they're not going to be able to do it. It involves using the quantum singularity that they use to amplify the subspace communication signal from Starfleet so that Voyager can hear it for, I think it's for 11 minutes a day or something like that. They can have communication with Starfleet. So what happens is they discover that the quantum singularity that they use to make that whole thing happen is undergoing fluctuations. When the fluctuations get to a certain range, which they will in a few days, it will be able to amplify the signal strongly enough that they can send a transporter beam through it. And if they can do that, they can beam the crew back to the Alpha Quadrant. But the fluctuations will only last for a few hours once they get to the level that they need to be. And then once they subside, they won't get back to that level again for centuries. So if they're going to do this and it's going to work, they have to do it soon, and they get a few hours to accomplish it, and then that window is closed. So there's got to be a ticking clock. Now, we've got to have a reason in the episode for me to title it Pale Blue Dot. I need to indulge my love of Carl Sagan, so I need to justify that within the story. So at some point during the episode, there needs to be a scene where Janeway is talking to someone, and perhaps she's speaking with Seven of Nine or maybe Chakotay, and Janeway is musing about a bit of science history that she's become particularly fond of these last few years. I think this would be appropriate because Janeway's background is that she is supposedly a scientist, so this would mean something to Janeway to tell this story. She talks about how back in the 20th century, scientists from Earth launched a probe that eventually reached the very edge of the solar system, which was a big deal at the time, and an astronomer, maybe she name drops Carl Sagan, maybe not, but an astronomer had the idea of pointing the probe's camera back toward the Earth and taking a picture. And when they saw the picture, all that was visible of Earth was just this pale blue dot that you could hardly even see. And people at the time marveled at how small and insignificant it looked and at how far away their probe now was. Janeway says, that she's spent the last 7 years wishing they could ever be that close to Earth again. Seeing that pale blue dot would be like a miracle to them because it would mean that they were almost home. So, that's why we call it pale blue dot. Now, there's got to be a crisis in the episode, so there will be a little crisis when it looks like it won't work after all. They've been working on this project. They think they've got it cracked, and then something happens in it. They're like, oh shit, this isn't going to work after all. There's a little bit of panic. There's some dejection. People think, we were this close, but we're not going to make it. Maybe they do some tests. They attempt to beam some objects through the wormhole, and the objects come out the other side, and they're all mangled and warped, and they're like, oh man, we can't do that to a person. But then Barclay, good old Barclay, back at Starfleet, he has a late night revelation for how to solve the problem. He realizes that if the transport is initiated from the Starfleet end of things on Earth, while bridging their transporter with Voyager's transporter through the wormhole, they can complete the transport successfully. And Barclay just knows this is going to work, but he needs to prove it. He can't let any more time go by because their window is closing. So he gets up in the middle of the night for him and he takes a chance. He finds Voyager's prefix codes in the computer, which allows him to override Voyager's onboard computer through the subspace link and create the link between his transporter and Voyager's transporter, and he beams himself onto Voyager. He materializes in Voyager's transporter room, and everybody on Voyager is just amazed and astounded and super happy that it looks like this is going to work, and the crew, with their time running out, immediately begins preparing to leave. So, because he was the first person through just to test it, Barclay is also the first person to beam back, but before he returns to Earth from Voyager through the wormhole, he takes a look around and he says to Janeway, I'm glad I got to see this ship for myself. Because the catch is, the crew is all going to beam back through this subspace wormhole thing that they've created, which means they're going to have to leave Voyager itself behind. Voyager can't come home with them. The ship has to stay. And because they can't just leave a Starfleet vessel adrift in a still mostly uncharted, strange part of the galaxy, they're going to have to scuttle the ship. They're going to have to destroy the ship after everybody's gone. So that's the sad note of the episode. So everyone beams back to the Alpha Quadrant safely. Tom and B'Elanna with their newborn daughter. Again, we're going to have to figure out how to resolve that, just as with my other pitch. They beam back safely. They materialize in Starfleet headquarters, and they are greeted by Admiral Paris, who embraces his son and embraces B'Elanna, his daughter-in-law, and meets his granddaughter for the first time. They have this wonderful reconciliation scene together. And then finally, after everybody else has beamed back, the doctor has been sent back. Maybe they can just beam him back while he's got his mobile emitter on. So the doctor goes too. The doctor doesn't have to stay behind. Everybody else has left, except for the last two, Chakotay and Janeway, captain and first officer. And they're together on the bridge after everybody else is gone. They initiate the self-destruct sequence in the classic Star Trek captain first officer way, just like we saw Picard and Riker do a couple of times in Star Trek The Next Generation. And then after they initiate the self-destruct sequence, Chakotay leaves. Janeway asks to have a moment alone to herself on the bridge, and Chakotay respects that, and Chakotay leaves. Gets on the turbo lift, goes to the transporter room, and Chakotay beams back. And Janeway lingers for a moment on the bridge. She takes one last look around, kind of, looks at the different stations, looks at the view screen, just kind of takes it all in. And then we follow Janeway, and if it would be at all feasible from a production standpoint, I would love to do this as an audacious final way to close the series. Do it in one continuous shot. Follow Janeway into the turbo lift. We ride with her on the turbo lift until it reaches the appropriate deck. Doors open. We get off with Janeway, walk down the corridor with her. She enters the transporter room. The computer warns her that there are 2 minutes to self-destruct, and at this point Janeway says, "Computer, discontinue further audio warnings." And she activates Voyager's transporter to take care of things from her end so that the transporters are bridged and she can beam away. And then she steps up onto the transporter pad and she taps her comm badge and she says, "Janeway to Pathfinder, 1 to beam home." And she dematerializes off the transporter pad, Janeway has left Voyager for the last time. And before anything else happens, we fade to black, credits, end of series. Now, I think that would have been a goddamn beautiful ending. I don't know if everybody would be satisfied with it because you wouldn't get to see Janeway actually arriving in the Alpha Quadrant, but I love ending it on that melancholy note. Janeway leaves the ship. She's the last one off as the captain. She says goodbye to the ship in her own sort of quiet, solitary way. And the final line spoken by any character in the series is Janeway saying, "One to beam home." And they beam her home. And we presume she makes it. And we also presume that shortly after that, the ship explodes, but we don't actually see that. We leave it sort of hanging, sort of suspended. And I really like that. I think that's a sad note to end it on, but also a happy note because everybody makes it home. And I don't know, I'm just... Now that, since I thought of that, and since I came up with especially the ending, I know that they were probably never ever going to end the show like that, and maybe there were good reasons why they didn't or why they didn't want to, but I feel like an ending like that would have been so beautiful, even for a show like Voyager that I feel never really lived up to its potential and was a very frustrating show, and as I have said many times, is my least favorite of the Star Trek series. If it had ended with something like that, I really think it would have redeemed a lot, you know? And of course, it's easy for me to say that because I'm the one who thought that shit up, and of course I think it's great. Self-praise is cheap praise, as they say. But anyway, those are my ideas. I would love to hear what you think about my pitches for a rewritten Voyager finale, and I would love to hear your pitches if you have your own completely different ideas. I think that would be a really fun discussion to have. So let's have that discussion in the comments of this video. And I want to say thank you one more time to Frank Voigt for leaving that comment on my time travel video and giving me the idea to do this. I thought this was a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble on about this as much as I enjoyed coming up with the ideas and telling you about them. So that's it for this video. A reminder, as always, if you're not listening to the Ensign's Log, the Star Trek-themed comedy podcast that I co-host with the great Jason Harding, you should listen to that. Give it a chance if you love the Star Trek stuff, because it's one of my favorite things that I've ever done. We have a great time on that show, and you can find the links to it in the description of this video. And if you enjoy this Star Trek stuff that I do, or the videos that I do on this channel about any subject, you just dig what I do on YouTube, and you can afford it and you think I'm worth it, you can help me to continue making videos by supporting this channel with a monthly donation through Patreon by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives. And one of the benefits you get for becoming a patron at any level is you get to vote for future topics of proper scripted Trek Actually videos. So keep that in mind as you are deciding whether or not to become a patron of this channel. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.